I have been asked more than once how it began. My steward assumed it was a calculated thing, that I had noticed her and arranged some occasion for proximity, the way powerful men sometimes do when they want something they will not name. He was wrong. He was wrong because the truth is more embarrassing and more honest than that. It was not I who chose her first. It was Vesper. And Vesper has never been wrong about a soul in her life. I should explain what kind of bird Vesper was, so you understand what I am telling you. She was a peregrine falcon, 3 years old when this story begins, the color of a winter storm, all slate and black and pale cream, with eyes so gold they looked lit from behind. I had raised her from a chick, fed her from my own hand, spent more hours in that mews than any master of Kelvern Hall had a right to spend. She was not a pet. She was not a performance. She was the one living thing on the estate that owed me nothing and gave everything freely, and I loved her for it in the way that only a man who has closed every other door can understand. She did not like people. That is an understatement. She had taken a strip of leather from a handler's glove the previous autumn. She had baited so violently at my head falconer's approach that the poor man had needed stitches above his eyebrow, and he had been working with her since she was 12 weeks old. She tolerated me. She endured my mother when absolutely necessary. She regarded every other living creature in the world as either prey or nuisance, and she made no effort to conceal which category any given person fell into. This is why, when I came to the mews on a cold Tuesday morning in the last week of October, and found her sitting calmly on the arm of a girl I had never seen before, I stopped walking. I stopped walking, and I stood under the arch of the mews door, and I said nothing at all for a very long time. The girl was young, not a child, but young, perhaps 19 or 20, with dark hair pinned back under a plain cap, a gray wool dress that was clean but had been mended at the cuffs twice over. She was not wearing a glove. She was not holding a lure or a piece of meat or any of the equipment my staff used to earn Vesper's cooperation on a good day. She was simply standing in the middle of the falconry yard with one arm extended, and Vesper was sitting on her wrist as though she had always lived there, ruffling her feathers once and settling back into perfect stillness. The girl was not speaking. She was not cooing or murmuring the way inexperienced people do around birds, that nervous stream of sound that sets every feather on edge. She was simply present, quiet, still in the particular way that is not the stillness of fear, but the stillness of a person who has no argument with the world at this moment. Vesper looked at the girl looked at Vesper, I looked at both of them. My head falconer, who had come up beside me without my noticing, said very quietly, "That's the girl Mrs. Peel sent down from the house. Extra hands for the week while the stable lads are away at the county fair." "She has no glove," I said. "No, your grace." "Vesper bites." "She hasn't," he said, and he sounded as baffled as I felt. I watched for another minute. Then I turned and walked away, because something was moving in my chest that I had no name for and had not felt in 3 years, and it made me deeply uncomfortable. Her name was Maurice Vane. I learned this not by asking. I did not ask, because asking would have required admitting I wanted to know, but because I overheard my housekeeper, Mrs. Peel, speaking to the kitchen girl at supper that evening. Maurice Vane. Daughter of a tenant farmer 2 miles down the road. The family had fallen on difficult times since her father's illness, and she had come to work in the house at 14, moved up through the scullery and the laundry and the stillroom, and had been at Kelvern for 6 years without, apparently, my ever noticing her existence. This did not say anything particularly good about me. I went back to the mews the next morning at the same hour. I told myself I was going to check on Vesper's weight, as I often did before a flight day. I checked Vesper's weight. Then I stood in the yard for approximately twice as long as was necessary for the purpose of checking a bird's weight, and Maurice Vane came through the gate with a bucket and a brush, and she saw me, and she curtsied, and she said, "Good morning, your grace," and went to work on the perches without any of the stiffness or overcaution that most servants showed in my vicinity. She was not afraid of me. That was the first thing I noticed. The second time I noticed anything about her, which was still 2 things more than I had noticed about anyone in a long while. Most people on the estate moved with a particular calibration around me, not obsequious, not rude, but careful, measured, the way you might move around a room where something breakable had been left on a shelf near the edge. I was used to it. I had, in fact, come to prefer it. It was clean and simple and required nothing of me. She just worked. briskly and quietly and without any apparent awareness that I was a man with a reputation for making conversation die around him like a fire deprived of air. She spoke to Vesper in a low, unhurried tone, not the performative gentle voice people used, but a practical, matter-of-fact murmur, the kind you might use to tell a sensible colleague what the plan for the afternoon was. "I'm just going to do the side purchase first, and then I'll get your water changed, and I imagine His Grace will take you out later if the cloud lifts." Vesper, for her part, watched this girl with the focused, appraising attention she reserved for things she found genuinely interesting. I said she doesn't usually take to strangers. Maris looked up, not startled, just acknowledging. "I know, Mr. hadn't told me she took a piece of his glove." "She did. I think she didn't like the way he was holding his arm. Too high, it puts a bird on the defensive." She paused, seeming to consider whether she'd overstepped. "Forgive me, Your Grace, I've only ever read about it." "Read about it where?" "There's a copy of the Turberville in the library, the old one. I borrowed it once when Mrs. Peel said the family wouldn't be returning for the season." She met my eyes briefly. "I can bring it back if it should not have left the shelf." "It has been on that shelf since my father's time," I said. "No one has opened it in 20 years. You may keep it as long as you like." She nodded and went back to her work, and I stayed in the mews for another half-hour that had nothing to do with Vesper's wait. The cloud did lift that afternoon. I flew Vesper over the north meadow, the clean sweep of her across a pale sky, the stoop and the return, the weight of her landing back on my glove. It was the only hour of most days when I felt like myself, when I was simply a man standing in a field with a bird, and everything that had happened 3 years ago existed at a bearable distance. That evening at dinner, my mother wrote from her house in the village that she would be arriving at the end of the week with a Miss Haverton and her family. Miss Haverton was 22, accomplished, from a family with a decent estate in Wiltshire, and my mother had been mentioning her at intervals for the better part of 2 years. I set the letter aside and went to bed early and did not sleep. I returned to the mews on Wednesday, and on Thursday. On Friday morning I arrived to find that Maris had been there before dawn. Vesper's feathers were perfectly clean, the perch was fresh, and there was a small piece of paper tucked under the edge of the feed plate on which was written in a neat and unpretentious hand. She was baiting at the south wall last evening. I think the light changes there at dusk and she doesn't like it. Might the perch be moved 6 feet north? I read this note 3 times. Then I moved the perch 6 feet north, and spent the better part of an hour thinking about a girl who got up before dawn to check on someone else's bird, and left a note rather than a complaint. I began to find reasons to be in the mews when she was working. This was not difficult to disguise. I was there often enough that my presence required no explanation. I would come to check Vesper's jesses, to assess her hood, to watch the sky, and she would work alongside me with that particular quality of company that did not demand anything. I had not understood until I encountered it how much I had been avoiding company for exactly that reason, because it always demanded something. Attention, response. The performance of a man who was present and engaged, and not still standing in a cold corridor outside a bedroom door, unable to go in and unable to leave. We talked in the way people talk when they are both doing something else. She told me how the Turberville described the manning of a fierce hawk, and I told her that Vesper had taken 8 weeks before she would step to my fist without a battle. She told me about her father's land, how the soil ran clay-heavy in the low field and sandy at the ridge, and I found myself saying things about the Kelvern acreage that I had not thought about in years, the way my own father had walked those fields and known every variation in the ground. One afternoon, almost without knowing I had arrived there, I told her about my wife. It was not a speech, it was not a confession. It came out sideways, the way grief sometimes does when you are not braced against it. I was watching Vesper on the perch, and I said, "My wife used to say I spent more time in this yard than in the house." And then there was a pause, and I said, "She was not wrong." And then I said, quieter, "She died in the winter 3 years ago, a fever. It was very fast." Maris was quiet for a moment, then she said, "I'm sorry." Not, "It must have been terrible." Not, "But you were so young and she was so young." Not, "At least she did not suffer long," which was the lie people told as comfort. Just, "I'm sorry," as though my loss was real and mattered and did not need to be managed or made smaller or reframed into something more bearable. Something in me that had been braced for 3 years, braced against pity, against the kind words that felt like smallness, Against the way grief made people uncomfortable, so they tried to end it for you, shifted slightly. Like a door that had been held shut by pressure, finding the pressure eased. "Thank you," I said. And that was all, and neither of us said anything else for a while, and it was perfectly all right. My mother arrived on Saturday with Miss Haverton and her family. Miss Haverton was everything my mother had said, accomplished, lovely, pleasant to speak to over dinner. She played the pianoforte beautifully and laughed at exactly the right moments and asked me sensible questions about the management of the estate. She was not unkind. She was entirely blameless. I sat across from her at the dinner table and thought about a note tucked under a feed plate. I did not go to the Mews on Sunday. I told myself it was because guests required my attention, and this was true enough. On Monday morning I arrived early before the household was fully awake and found the yard empty and Vesper settled and calm. There was a fresh note on the plate. She took a mouse on her own last evening, came in before dark. I think she is happier with the perch moved. She seems less restless. I stood in the cold yard with this note in my hand and admitted to myself, with the clarity that comes only in the early morning when there is no one to perform for, that I was in very serious trouble. What I felt was not a young man's dazzlement. I was 37 years old and had loved one woman in my life with everything I had, and lost her, and shut every door that grief showed me. What I felt for Mari's vein was different in texture from that early love, less fire, more gravity. The sense of being pulled toward a particular point on the earth, not violently but steadily, the way a compass returns to north. She did not know I felt it. She gave me no indication she felt anything in return beyond a professional courtesy and perhaps the ease of a person who is more comfortable with honesty than most. She had never touched my hand or held my gaze longer than was natural. She had never spoken to me as anything other than her employer. She was, in every visible way, simply a girl who came to the Mews in the early morning and left notes about a Falcon's state of mind. And Vesper sat on her bare wrist like she'd been born there. On Tuesday, my mother drew me aside after luncheon and spoke warmly about Miss Haverton's family and the particular suitability of the match. I listened. I said the things one says. In the afternoon, I went to my study and sat by the window and watched the gray October light move across the fields and did not answer any correspondence. On Wednesday, Mrs. Peel informed me that the stable hands had returned from the fair, and the extra help was no longer needed. Mari's vein would be returning to her regular duties in the scullery on Friday morning. I said, "I see." I went to the Mews that afternoon and stood in the yard and looked at the perch that was now 6 feet north of where it had been, and at the clean, fresh water, and at Vesper sitting on her block with her feathers perfectly smooth. And I thought about how still this place had been before, and how different still it was going to feel. Thursday came. I did not go to the Mews. I told myself this was appropriate. She was a servant girl, and I was her employer, and I had no rights over her time, no claim on the particular quality of her company, no standing to be bereft that a temporary arrangement was ending in exactly the way it had always been scheduled to end. I had a guest in my house who was by any measure an excellent prospect. I had a mother who wanted me to be less alone. I had an estate that required a mistress and someday an heir. I sat in my library with a book I did not read, and Vesper baited twice at nothing in the Mews yard, which my head falconer reported to me at tea time with the slightly baffled expression of a man who could not account for the bird's mood. On Friday morning, the frost came in hard. The kitchen windows were clouded with it, and the yard outside the Mews was sheeted in white, and I was standing at my bedroom window looking at none of it in particular when I saw Vesper. She had not escaped. I want to be clear on this point because my head falconer is still sensitive about it. She had simply found her way out of the Mews through the hatch that Haddon had left unlatched the previous evening, and had, apparently, decided to take herself for a brief and unsanctioned excursion. This happened very rarely, twice in her life before this morning. Both previous times, she had gone to the North Meadow. This time, she had gone to the kitchen garden wall. I saw her from the window, a gray shape on a gray stone wall, entirely composed, feathers settled, watching something below her with that focused and particular golden gaze. I put on my coat and went down. Mari's was there. She was carrying a basket. She had come through the kitchen garden on her way, I later understood, to collect the last of the winter herbs before the frost finished them. When I came around the corner, she was standing very still under Vesper's wall with her arm raised. and Vesper was stepping carefully, with great dignity, from the stone down onto her wrist. They both looked at me when I came around the corner. I stopped walking. I had prepared in the abstract way one sometimes does, something to say. Something appropriate and measured and entirely within the correct register for a duke addressing a servant girl who had been temporarily assigned to his muse. A word of thanks, an acknowledgement of work well done. Possibly a small additional sum of wages, which Mrs. Peel could arrange without any need for further conversation. None of it arrived. What arrived instead was the particular silence that comes when a person finally stops pretending they do not know exactly what they are doing and why. Vesper looked at me, the way she always did, direct and golden and entirely without illusion. Maris looked at me, the way she always did, calm and clear without performance. The frost lay over everything. The kitchen garden, the stone wall, the pale fields beyond. Not cold in the way that drives you in, cold in the way that makes the world very quiet and very honest. I said, she has never gone to anyone else. Mari said, I know. Mr. Haddon told me. In 3 years, I said, she has gone to the North Meadow or she has come back to me. That is all. She looked at the bird, then back at me, waiting. I do not understand it, I said. I have thought about it for 3 weeks and I do not have an explanation. She does not perform for people. She does not offer herself to strangers. She has been difficult since my wife died. The whole muse has been difficult since then. Everything has been. I stopped. I had not intended to say that last part. It came out the way things came out around her, sideways, without ceremony. She said, I think she knows who is quiet. I looked at her. Not quiet in manner, she said, quiet underneath. The way some people are settled inside themselves, even when things are difficult. Horses are the same, and dogs, they don't go to the loudest or the kindest, necessarily, they go to the ones who aren't at war with themselves. She paused. Forgive me, that is a great deal to say to one's employer on a Friday morning. Don't apologize, I said. A pause. I was told, she said carefully, that my assignment to the muse ended today. It did. Then I should return the Turberville. She met my eyes. I'll leave it with Mrs. Peel. Something moved in me, that compass feeling, pointing north without asking my permission. I don't want the Turberville back, I said. I stopped again, began again. Miss Haverton is an excellent woman. My mother believes she would make an admirable Duchess of Kelvern. She is right on every point. Miss Haverton is accomplished and pleasant and would do the role a great deal of credit. Mari said nothing. Her face was very still. I have sat across from her at table 3 times this week, I said, and I cannot remember a single thing she said. Not because she said nothing worth remembering, I assure you she didn't, but because I was thinking about a note tucked under a feed plate. The frost, the quiet, Vesper's gold eyes, steady and unimpressed by the whole business. I am not good at this, I said. I was better at it once. I am telling you that as honest information, not as a plea for sympathy. I do not know how to offer what I think I am trying to offer. I have not tried to offer anything to anyone in 3 years, and I am aware I am doing it poorly. You're doing it clearly, she said, very quietly. Then let me do one thing clearly. I reached into my coat pocket and took out Vesper's hood, the worn one, dark leather, the one I'd made myself in the first year, the one I always used. The only belonging of that muse I would never have given to anyone. I held it out to her. She looked at it, then at me. The bird has better instincts than I do, I said. I am inclined to trust them. I would like you to stay at Kelvern, not in the scullery, not assigned to the muse as extra labor. I let the silence hold what I hadn't yet said. Then I said it. I would like you to stay as yourself, if you are willing, while I find out who you are and whether the compass in my chest that has been pointing in your direction for 3 weeks is pointing somewhere you are willing to go. She was quiet for a long moment, long enough that I felt the cold and the weight of the hood in my outstretched hand and the particular exposure of a man who has said an honest thing with no shelter around it. Then Mari's vein shifted Vesper on her wrist and reached out with her other hand and took the hood. Yes, she said. Just that, no performance, no tears, no speech. Only the word and the particular quietness of a person who means what they say. Vesper ruffled her feathers once, settled, and looked away toward the North Meadow with the air of a creature whose business here was concluded. I will not describe in any great detail what followed. That is a private story. I will say that my mother was considerably put out for approximately 6 weeks, and then considerably charmed for the rest of her life. I will say that Miss Haverton was, I have it on reliable authority, not heartbroken, and married a perfectly agreeable man in Wiltshire the following spring. I will say that my head falconer, Haddon, took one look at the situation in the spring and said only, "Well." That explains the bird then, and returned to his work without further comment. I will say that Maurice was not changed by becoming the Duchess of Kelvern. That is what I mean to say, and I want to say it precisely, because there is a version of this story where a girl is transformed by the right man's notice, made better, made lovelier, elevated by his attention, and that is not this story. She was already herself. The estate did not refine her. She simply occupied it, the way the falcon occupies the sky without argument. She learned what she needed to learn with the same quiet efficiency she'd brought to the Turberville and the perch placement and the early morning notes. She was not awed by the household. She was not frightened of my mother or my tenants or the neighbors who came to inspect her. She was steady in the way that she had always been steady, and I watched the house settle around that steadiness the way Vesper had settled on her arm. She learned my moods, which are not, I confess, always simple, without making a project of them. She knew when I needed the early morning quiet and when I needed company. She never asked me to be different from what I was. She never asked me to perform health or ease or recovery on any schedule other than my own. She understood, I do not know how, except that she simply did, that grief does not end, that it becomes instead a thing you carry differently over time, and that what I needed was not someone to take it from me, but someone to walk alongside me while I carried it. 3 months after she came to the Mews for the first time, I found her in the falconry yard at dusk, Vesper on her wrist, both of them watching the last of the light leave the northern hills. "She's happy," Maurice said, as I came to stand beside her. "She is," I said. And Vesper, in her opinion on the matter, leaned very slightly sideways until her feathered shoulder rested against the side of Maurice's jaw. A gesture I had seen her make exactly once before in her life, with me, on a morning in her first spring, when she had finally decided I was trustworthy. I had been 34 years old the first time. I had stood in the Mews with a peregrine falcon leaning against my jaw and felt, for the first time in a long while, that I was being seen. I was 37 now, standing in a frost-edged yard with the woman who had become my wife, and the bird that had known her before I did, and the quiet of a country evening settling over everything like something generous and unearned. I put my arm around her, and she leaned into me with that characteristic absence of drama, and Vesper watched the hills, and for the first time in 3 years I felt the past in its right place. Behind me, real and honored, but behind me. Some things are too specific to explain. Why the bird chose her, why the compass turned, why quiet settles on a man who has been loudly grief-stricken in his own private way and finally, slowly, becomes something else. I have no philosophy to offer. Only the memory of a gray morning and a frost-covered wall, and a girl who said yes without fuss, and a falcon who had known, as they always do, exactly what she was doing. I have never doubted her since,